I'm sure you've all heard the story of the 7 blind men who touched different parts of an elephant and yet could never tell that it was actually an elephant. One man touched the elephant's leg and thought it was a tree trunk. Another touched the tail and thought it was a snake. And so the story goes on. The experience of touching and feeling was very much real for all of them.
Pratyaksha, especially the inner pratyaksha, what we call experience or anubhava, that is paramount. Even if an apparent meaning of a Vedic passage is contradicting what you have experienced, then go with the experience. Does it then mean that you are rejecting the meaning of a Vedic sentence? He says, no, that's not the meaning of the sentence. You have to dig deeper to understand what that actually meant. Because if you falsify your very experience, then there is absolutely no way to access knowledge. Because experience is at the heart of acquiring knowledge, and experience has to be categorized as something that is infallible.
Namaste. I'm Dr. Sarita Sheshigiri. I am an ethnographer and a user researcher whose job it has been to gather qualitative data from out there in the field to make sense of it, analyze it, and disseminate it. I've used various manual and digital means to do all this, and yet it has left me frustrated. In fact, the present-day tools for qualitative analysis have rendered research outputs at best as colorful cutouts and coffee table catalogs. So where is the rigor missing in our reasoned thinking? And can we do something about it? I'm joined here today by our very special guest, Dr. V. Srinidhi. Srinidhi ji has had over 20 years of training in Shastric studies. Apart from being trained in modern medicine, he has also done a PhD in public policy from IIM Bangalore, where he has looked at the interface between Ayurveda and modern medicine. He is also one of the members of the team that started an educational initiative called Purna Pramati, which is a center for integrated learning, where students are taught to be rooted in traditional knowledge while navigating through modern systems. Till recently, Srinidhi ji has been a researcher of public health and health systems. Namaste, Srinidhi ji, and thank you so much for joining us today. This will be our very first episode titled Madhvacharya's Approach, Let's Get Acquainted. It's part of a tripartite series on Madhvacharya's philosophy, basically, where we look at Madhvacharya's Tattvavada school of Vedanta specifically. I'm really happy, Srinidhi ji, that I'm finally able to discuss certain key problems and issues with you. Who else but an expert in traditional systems and modern approaches like you can help us make sense of the problem and also give us the means to navigate through it. So, Srinidhi ji, from what I understand, you have had exposure to traditional knowledge system apart from being trained in mainstream studies. So how was your experience in having connected with traditional knowledge as part of through your academic journey, and how did it benefit you?
Okay, thank you, Sarita ji. So this is a journey that I didn't plan for. And I don't think I was trying to get exposed or engaged with Indian knowledge systems from an academic point of view from the beginning. It's by God's grace, the ecosystem and the atmosphere in which I was growing up had these possibilities. So I was born in a practicing Madhva family. So my grandfather taught me the Vishnu Sahasranama and such recitations at very early age. I'm told I was able to recite by heart Vishnu Sahasranama when I was probably 4 or 5. And I consider that as a great fortune. That had the kind of impact to be living a life rooted in the traditional knowledge ecosystem. Not that I was exposed to Shastric studies significantly during that age, but there was a cultural experience in the family early on. Later, when I moved for higher studies to Bengaluru, I stayed with my uncle, Sri Vedagarbha Sheshagiri Acharya. So he taught me the basics and some of the epistemological texts also in Madhvacharya's tradition. Later on, I had the opportunity to study under a big name in Madhvacharya school, Dr. Vyasanakare Prabhanjanacharya is my uncle too. And this was happening parallelly with my undergrad studies in medicine. Later on, by God's blessings, I would say, I have been studying under Bhandarakeri Swamiji for the last 10 plus years. Throughout this, as I mentioned earlier, there was no explicit intent of trying to look at it from an academic point of view or trying to connect them to a contemporary perspective. It was part of a culture. It was part of a tradition to actually study, practice, and continue the learning and living tradition. But when I look back, I do see that there were significant points of engagement that provided a lot of clarity on how do we understand even the mainstream questions if we have a good grounding in traditional knowledge systems. So a couple of examples. I mean, for example, I had an inclination towards mathematics and logical thinking, etc., during the early part of my high school and college education before medicine. And that was the time when I was studying Pramana Shastra parallelly. Those texts were dealing with the idea of logic and fallacies in logical analysis to such a great depth that I wasn't shaken by some of the subtle communications that happen in the modern world about the faith or religion aspects of one's living, right? I mean, so you have when you have a strong grounding that is not only a system of practice and faith, but is actually grounded in a strong logical system, that would make navigation with the modern world, at least in your minds, a little easier. And there is no kind of a surprise or an awe feeling when you get exposed to the science and technology greatness to suggest that, well, whatever you guys had in the tradition is just a superficial or a pseudoscientific kind of a thing. So it needed a significant grounding, and thankfully I could get that, and that provided at least I would say the clarity on the roots of our tradition. Later on, in the medical school, I think, I mean, medical school and that environment is really unique for a couple of things. One, it's probably the only discipline, I think, other than say philosophy and such, that actually engage with fundamental questions of life and death. For the fact that, I mean, you're actually dealing with to understand what is life and death. So that's one important feature of that field itself. The second, it is that field which has to navigate constantly two kind of opposing worldviews. Rationality at one end, because medical sciences per se, after all, is scientific inquiry. I mean, it's about evidence, it's about rational approach to what works, what doesn't work, what's the basis for disease, what works as a treatment, what doesn't. So it's a scientific field. But at the other end, you're also dealing with human emotions, you're dealing with suffering, you're dealing with belief and faith, you're dealing with aspects that medicine many a times may fail to explain within the scientific frame. So you're constantly engaging in a kind of a challenge from an epistemic or a knowledge system sense, that do you go by your gut feel, your quote unquote experience, your appreciation of humanities and social sciences aspect versus rationality, logic, etc. So, but I could not get a very convincing framework that could bring these together. That's where I think the training in traditional knowledge systems actually helped me, wherein you can rationally, well, rationality has multiple connotations in the modern world, but I'm just using it in a loose sense. You could logically appreciate the place of belief systems, at the same time believe in the role that a logic plays, and understand the limits. So what is the way in which you bring both these kind of intellectual logical approaches and belief and intangible metaphysical aspects? So that's where I think the sacred knowledge systems like the Indian knowledge systems, the Vedantic knowledge systems, that are not relegating logic as something secondary, but at the same time not giving undue emphasis only on logic. So that kind of a very insightful approach was perhaps helping to think through these dichotomies that the modern systems could pose. Then lastly, during my PhD program, when trying to look at Ayurveda and biomedicine, and also later on in my work on public health, there was always this question on what is truth, how do you identify or how do you separate out subjectivity from an objectively verifiable truth? Is there an objective truth at all? And these are I sometimes used to think that these are theoretical, philosophical questions, may not be of real interest for practical research, but only when I actually entered into social science research, I understood that this is actually the crux of how you collect data, how you interpret data, depending on the frameworks that you have. So the very notion of how you tease out these subjectivity, objectivity questions, interpretivism, positivism questions, I think in these challenges, Indian knowledge systems, especially my training has been in Madhvacharya school, that provided a lot of clarity. I think I should be able to explain that a little better as we move along, but this is broadly how I got exposed to, probably not with an intent to see the applications, but now I'm able to see much more in terms of what they have to offer. And surely this is not the goal of what they're trying to offer. This is just a kind of a byproduct of the knowledge systems. They're trying to solve a much deeper question, but kind of some applications to contemporary research is also a possibility.
Definitely. In fact, I agree with you there. I remember many a times as part of my field studies, whenever I have gone to gather data in the field as part of the user studies, many a time when people have responded to certain questions, right, and they answer in a certain way, and then we try to typeset them to that kind of answers that they have given. And then because we have had that preconceived, constructed theoretical paradigm, whatever playing in our mind, we try to force fit them into that Procrustean theme, that model that we have built, and then we try to justify it, that this is exactly why they were saying what they did. So that's also my part of my dissatisfaction in the mainstream approach. But I'm sure we can work this out and see what we can take from our traditional knowledge systems to make it more rigorous. So moving on, my first question to you for today is, why should we consider the Indic approach of philosophy?
Okay. To be honest, I haven't had a detailed engagement with Western philosophy or modern philosophies to make a very strong statement on what makes the difference very clear. But based on my engagement with Indian knowledge systems and Indian philosophies, I think there are some 2-3 striking ideas that make it interesting for me. One is that there isn't a good, accurate translation that's possible from the word philosophy to an Indic term that would capture that very essence in the same meaning and in the same usage. That itself is telling, because that means that philosophy as a disciplinary practice in an isolated sense was perhaps not how the Indian knowledge systems were organized. So philosophy, or what we may call religion, culture, etc. I mean, all these are loaded terms with different connotations, but we are using it in the general understanding for the purposes here. So religion, culture, philosophy, as not silos, but as a part of a lived reality in the Indian context. So the language that you use, the practices that you have, are all loaded with philosophical ideas, and therefore that makes the second distinction obvious from this. That second distinction is that philosophy is not an elitist pursuit in the Indian context. It is something that is ingrained in everyone's lifestyle, and therefore not in a simplistic sense, but in a very rooted sense, I think it is the commonsensical part of Indian lifestyle. Common sense, not to say that, well, you don't need to think too much, but it is so common that there is a common understanding of what some of the very strong philosophical ideas are that are ingrained. And therefore, so one is that there is a percolation of those ideas into lifestyle, into culture. That doesn't mean that people haven't thought through these ideas threadbare. I mean, you see a very serious engagement with all these ideas in the classical texts of Vedanta, Nyaya, and these Darśanas. So perhaps the term that we should be looking at is Darśana rather than philosophy when we are looking at the Indian knowledge systems, because it's about the perspective or the insight that is at the core, and not a mere intellectual engagement or an exercise to find something without any purpose or an insight. So philosophy in the Indian context, I would say Darshana, vision, perspective.
So that brings me to my next question. What are some of the popular perspectives, darshanas, in the Indic system, and how were these darshanas different from each other? Were they different from each other, and if so, how?
Okay, fine. So let me frame this in this way. So you have a corpus, or the original set of works, the Vedas, the Panchama Veda, that is the Puranas, the Mahabharata, Ramayana, the Itihasa, then the Dharma Shastra, the Vedangas like the Vyakarana, Shiksha, and all of that, right? So these are kind of original works that are also technically called Vidyasthanas. So the source material to arrive at a philosophy, to use the contemporary word. What the Indian traditions have done is to distill out from these set of works an essential idea that different people thought as the core of all of these texts. So the popular categorization of 6 darshanas, the 6 schools of Indian philosophies, the Shad Darshanas. I'm going to problematize that a little later, but for the time being, let me take the 6 darshanas as a given, because that's how the general approach to looking at Indian philosophy would start. I mean, so you say there are 6 schools of philosophy. There are other non-Vedic schools, and then the Vedic schools, and within the Vedic schools you have the 6 darshanas. Those are Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Purvamimamsa, and Uttaramimamsa, also called Vedanta. So you have these 6 darshanas. So what makes it a darshana, and what are the fundamental elements that make them different? So they are all called darshanas, so there should be something common, and they have 6 subcategories, so there should be something distinct in each of them. So the commonality is both in terms of structure and approach. So by structure, I mean all of these have a sutra. So you have one Muni, one original thinker, who has composed a set of sutras, a set of aphorisms or the short ideas compiled into a short text that are capturing the fundamentals of what they have perceived as the essence of the original texts. So they're all trying to look at the original texts and trying to see, okay, what is the main idea that I can encapsulate in a short text. And this sutra kind of approach is something that you see in all these 6 darshanas. So all 6 of them have a sutra of their own. So you have the Kapila Sutra for Sankhya, then you have Patanjala Sutras for yoga, then you have the Gautama Sutra for Nyaya, Kanada Sutra for Vaisheshika, then Jaimini Sutras for Purvamimamsa, and Brahma Sutras of Vedavyasa or Badarayana for the Uttaramimamsa. So one, you have the sutras as the core original texts, and then you have a tradition that tries to explain the ideas from those sutras, but they do need an explanation, a commentary. So there is a commentarial tradition for each of these.
Which is the Bhashya.
Yeah, so you sometimes call the first one as Vartika, or mostly the Bhashyas. So it is the Bhashyas, and then you have the Tikas. So there is that commentary tradition. So Sutra and then the Bhashya, and the tradition continues. So second is the intent that they are trying to capture. So what's the approach that they have used, and what is the core element that they are trying to solve? So all of them have one as their primary essential idea that they want to communicate. So for example, the Sankhya is, I'm trying to paraphrase it for comprehension purposes, to get a larger overview. So each of these, so Sankhya is talking about distinctions. So it's about Prakriti and Purusha, and your ability to distinguish this is the core message of all of these texts. So they're saying, okay, so you have the entire Vedic corpus, you have the Bhagavad Gita, you have, so I need a perspective, I need a vision. So if you can help me with that vision, that gives me an aid to access these texts. So these darshanas are trying to provide those visions. So one vision is, okay, see, all of these are trying to tell you that you have to separate Prakriti from Purusha, and that is in fact the core sadhana or the core element for attaining moksha. So if you can appreciate and get that realization of Prakriti Purusha Viveka, that's the path that you need to pursue. So that's what Sankhya is trying to argue or communicate. Yoga is trying to communicate the significance of mind. And we all know that, yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. So chitta vritti, so the different transformations that happen in mind, how do you calm it down, and how do you control the mind, the methods of controlling the mind. So the focus of the entire Yoga Sutras is on the mind, which is basically to tell you that the entire Vedic corpus is also trying to tell that part. So they're trying to give you that lens. That, okay, use this as the main frame, then you can make sense of this entire corpus. Then you have the Nyaya. Nyaya is trying to say, see, everything that's being laid out in this Shastric corpus is about knowledge. So it's either the object of knowledge, or the knower, the person who is trying to get that knowledge, or the knowledge itself, so, or an object of erroneous knowledge. So essentially the whole world can be looked at from the perspective of knowledge and its associations with that object. So they're all basically trying to give different ontologies in a way, and different lenses for us to wear to look at the entire Vedic corpus and argue that this is the essence, and subtly saying not the other. So therefore there is a unique position that they're all trying to carve out for themselves. So Sankhya has a position, Yoga has a position, Nyaya has a position. The Vaisheshikas are talking about the objects. So for that reason people say, Kanada should be called the father of physics. I mean, I'm not a great fan of those repackaging in a way. But it's true that Kanada was trying to explain the physical reality to a greater extent. So therefore, there is an emphasis on objects and defining them, categorizing them, identifying them explicitly and accurately, so that Padartha Shastra as the core at the Vaisheshika, in the Vaisheshika school. Then you have the Puramimamsa school. That is talking about dharma. Dharma in the sense of prescribed duty. Not in the sense of the larger ethos, dharma that holds together, not that dharma, but dharma as a karma, as a ritual, as an activity, as a prescribed yajna, for example. So the all of the Vedic corpus is trying to tell you to perform an yajna. And how do you perform if there is a contradiction between different prescriptions? How do you resolve? So they were focusing on the methodology of resolving apparent contradictions and arriving at what is a karma, what is the activity, what is the ritual that should be followed. So that was the focus of the Puramimamsa. Then you have the Uttaramimamsa focusing on Brahman, the supreme being. So all these schools had a sutra, a bhashya, a commentary tradition, the one kind of essential idea, and arguing that this is the entire focus of the Vedic corpus. And then you say, then you build everything else around that. So keep this at the center, so build everything else around that. So that has been kind of the 6 darshanas, and the Madhvacharya's darshana is one of the interpretations of the Uttaramimamsa darshana, that is the Vedanta darshana. So unlike the bhashyas of the other 5, you have multiple bhashyas here for the Brahma Sutras, which were trying to suggest that what the Brahma Sutras were trying to say, that they are themselves contested among the bhashyakaras.
So you mentioned these Shadadarshanas. Did these Shadadarshanas, or the 6 lenses, so to speak, perspectives, engage with each other at all? And if so, how?
Oh yeah, I mean, so in fact, that's the hallmark of the Indic traditional kind of legacy, that the debates between these darshanas was considered a sacred act for each of these darshanas to be engaging in. Not necessarily in the sense that that the knowledge system itself would evolve as we understand in the modern world, that there is a something starts as a primitive idea, and then people try to build and expand and sometimes correct. That was not the intent here, because here the initial idea is a darshana. So you're not trying to fundamentally alter that darshana, unless you are also a darshanika, unless you are also somebody who is able to create another darshana. So darshana by definition is something that you can't change. I mean, it's a vision that you have. You're only trying to interpret, understand, expand, make sense of that darshana. So when people were engaging with multiple darshanas, so they were trying to clarify their positions. No, this is not what we meant. So if you have an objection on us, this is how we try to address it. So there has been a tradition of debates among these darshanas. Specifically, we see that in the Uttaramimamsa tradition, because in the Brahma Sutras, for example, there is a dedicated section that deals with all the other darshanas and argues that there is one or the other problem when looked at from the Uttaramimamsa darshana perspective in those darshanas, and therefore it tries to argue that this is superior in the logical framework, the evidence space, and therefore this must be seen as the approach to looking at the entire corpus. So all these darshanas engaged with each other in a debating fashion, not necessarily to change the position, but to clarify their positions. Some won, some didn't at different points in time, depending on who was representing, what was their intellectual ability and things like that. So there has been that continuing tradition, and that is kind of an indication to another unique feature of the Indian philosophical traditions. So you have the Darshana at one end and also an intellectual engagement at the other end. So it is not purely something that is revealed, and it is not purely something that is intellectually argued. So you're trying to find a balance between the two. So that was happening.
So in a way, it was balancing itself out,
Right.
apart from in both ways, not working in silo,
Right.
and yet being in engagement with each other. So I have another question. So from what I understand, the most recent of the Darśanas is the Uttaramimamsa. Here in the Uttaramimamsa tradition, we already had Sri Shankaracharya and Sri Ramanujacharya, who had already come and made their point. So what was the need for another school such as the one from Sri Madhvacharya, and also what was the novelty of approach that his school offered?
Okay, so this is a topic that we can perhaps discuss for days because it is entirely about Madhvacharya's contributions and how they differed from other schools, and that's in fact what any of the a new school would try to do when they are trying to establish themselves against the others. Well, here are the differences, and therefore there is a need for this, right? But I think I would like to draw your attention to a couple of important things based on what we have discussed till now, so that we can. I mean, the details of the differences in tenets are many, but I want to focus on a couple of things that can give clarity to some parts of the discussions that we had. One, I mentioned earlier that I'm probably trying to problematize this classification itself when looking at it from Madhvacharya's perspective. Because, I mean, you asked the point that, well, is the Shaddarshana, I mean, among the Shaddarshanas, is the Uttaramimamsa being the last, and then Madhvacharya also being one of them. So, right? So, that's the framing. But according to Madhvacharya, there is no chronology in these darshanas. So this is a very modern way of understanding which is existing, and that's how, in fact, even in mainstream, I mean, because the Indian traditional knowledge is also getting significantly affected by how the Western world is thinking about us, and therefore we have built in this chronology in our minds that, okay, this is the Sankhya, then the yoga. I mean, I also narrated in that fashion, right? But what Madhvacharya says is that, well, anadi kalato vrittaha samayahi pravahataha. All these schools existed all the time. It is only that some people at some point in time find something more interesting and they want to propagate that, and then you see some peaking of that school. And so it's a phenomenon that would happen all the time. So there isn't any significant chronological order to these darshanas. That's one. Second, there is a very interesting revolutionary idea that Madhvacharya brought in to the way to look at these categories of darshanas themselves. Because, so what he said was, you see, I mean, this is a serious philosophical problem. So you have the Brahma Sutras, that is the core text for the Uttaramimamsa tradition. But the Brahma Sutras are targeting other schools and rejecting them. So the Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, etc. But at the same time, the Brahma Sutra tradition, the Uttaramimamsa tradition, is engaging with the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is a part of the Itihasa corpus, and Itihasa Purana, that Panchama Veda corpus, right? In the Bhagavata Purana, you have Sankhya, the Kapila Sankhya, as a system that is greatly expounded. So if you are rejecting Kapila's Sankhya, how is it that Kapila's Sankhya is also part of your own system of Puranas and the Itihasas? The Bhagavad Gita refers to Sankhya, Kritante, Proktani. So it refers to Sankhya Shastra. It refers to Yoga Shastra. but the Brahma Sutras are refuting Sankhya and Yoga. So Sri Madhvacharya gave this completely new idea that, see, there are two types or two versions of these schools. So he said, well, the Uttaramimamsa school is the complete school. And what we now have as Yoga, Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika are not the original Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga or Sankhya. So he suggested that there is actually an earlier existing yoga tradition started by Lord Dattatreya, not the one that we currently have in the Patanjala yoga tradition. Similarly, Sankhya tradition that was started by Narayana Kapila, which is mentioned in Bhagavata, the one that he taught his mother Devahuti, right? So that Sankhya is not in contradiction to the Uttaramimamsa school, the Vedanta school. So he was trying to revive some of the lost traditions and say that, well, you see, in many portions, you do recognize that Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya are discussed in great respect. They are mentioned with great respect, even in the Uttaramimamsa tradition. So how do you make sense of that? So Madhvacharya was arguing that there is a reconciliation possible with all these schools if you go to their originals and not the way in which they are currently in practice. So there is some disconnect that has that has come into the being. So therefore, if you revive the earlier traditions, then there is no contradiction between Sankhya, Yoga. So Sankhya of Narayana Kapila, Yoga of Dattatreya. Then for Nyaya Vaisheshika, he suggested there is an original Nyaya Shastra called Brahmatarka by Lord Narayana. That is the source Nyaya school. Because, I mean, Nyaya is talking about knowledge, tools of knowledge. I mean, how can you say that I'm looking at the Brahma and doing Brahma Mimamsa and I'm not worried about tools of knowing? That just cannot be reconciled. So he said, well, there is a way of knowing the epistemology, not the one that is contemporarily popular in the Nyaya school. So therefore he, in a way, dismantled this structure of the Darśanas in the way they were understood as the 6 ways of knowing the Vedas. So he was saying, well, obviously, because there is a contradiction, it cannot be that there is that both are true. So one is true. Every one of them would say that. I mean, the yoga school would say mine is true. I mean, that's the beauty of an engaging tradition, that everybody would claim that theirs is correct and they would engage with the other. Not that without even engaging, I'll say, okay, everybody, let's coexist, let's not fight. That has never been the Indic traditional ethos. So you claim yours is correct and you engage, you show why you think yours is correct. At the same time, try to resolve these conflicts of, well, if yours is correct and Nyaya is wrong, what do you mean by your ways of knowing? Do you have another system? Yes, we have another system. That's our epistemology. We have another Sankhya, which is present in the Bhagavata. We have another Yoga, because controlling mind cannot be relegated as, well, that's insignificant. Of course, Brahman is important, but all of these are necessary tools. Therefore, Madhvacharya provided another insight of trying to look at these, I won't call them Darśanas from this perspective, because this is the Darśana and all others can be reconciled as talking about the same idea if you revive them back to their original teachings. In their existing mode, they are in fact rejected from the Uttaramimamsa of Madhvacharya school also. So that's the second difference. The third and very important, I would say, is the holistic and the Samanvaya approach that he brought in. Because, this is one kind of Samanvaya that I was talking about. The Yoga, Sankhya, all of these actually talk about some common idea if you look at it from the earlier traditions. But more importantly, there were also, that this is actually interesting. So he was talking about Samanvaya while trying to reject the existing ways of knowing. So, Samanvaya would mean that you bring all people together. But the position was, because other schools were trying to argue that only theirs is correct, you cannot bring that together. You have to invent another way by which you bring the tenets that they were representing together without bringing those schools. Let me explain this with a couple of examples. So, you have a few schools that were talking about the significance of the Vedas and say that, well, Mahabharata, Purana, the Ramayana, those are not important. So, those do not tell you the truth. They are only for an initiation. They're stories. So, they do not contain truth. Truth is in the Vedas. Even within the Vedas, there was a classification made of Jnana Kanda and Karma Kanda. So, only Jnana Kanda is to be treated as telling you the truth. Even within that, there were traditions saying, no, only a few sentences are more important, not the entire Vedic text. So, there was a compartmentalization of the Vedic corpus done. So, one of the significant contributions from Madhvacharya's perspective was that the entire Vedic corpus is valid, and in its entirety is telling that same truth of the supremacy of Lord Vishnu. And everything else is followed, can be derived from that principle. So, the problem for earlier schools was, well, if we are talking about the significance of karma, then there is a section in the Vedic corpus that is talking about karma, and therefore we will take that as important. And if the school's tenet is that jnana is important, then that section we will take and we will discard the other. If there is a bheda vakya and then there is an abheda vakya, so one that is talking about identity and the other talking about difference between jivatma and paramatma, so they would have a tenet and say, okay, because our school is talking about bheda, we discard those sentences that are talking about abheda. And the others would say, we are talking about abheda, so we will discard sentences talking about bheda. And then you had bhakti marga and jnana marga and karma marga. So, they would choose, okay, this, and I will focus on this, the others are not important. So, what Madhvacharya did was to bring all of these together, and I can explain the complete framework to you in my meta frame. So, that's what Madhvacharya was trying to do. So, he, for example, said, bhakti, karma and jnana cannot be treated as separate paths. Karma leads to jnana, and bhakti has jnana inbuilt in it. So, if it is bhakti without jnana, it is blind. If it is jnana without bhakti, it is dry. I mean, I'm paraphrasing him. And if it is karma without jnana or bhakti, then it is useless. And if it is jnana and bhakti without karma, that is just not attainable. So, in a way, all of these were necessary in the complete framework of what he emphasized as bhakti marga, but that bhakti inherently had jnana in it. He defined jnana purvaha parasnehaha bhakti. So, the bhakti is which has jnana and preeti. So, only that is called bhakti, otherwise it is blind devotion. That's not bhakti. Similarly, karmana shuddha sattvasya. So, karma leads to the cleansing of one's mind, and that is necessary for jnana or bhakti. So, karma, jnana and bhakti he reconciled. He was the only serious bhashyakara who wrote an extensive commentary on the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Bhagavata. So, you had the Prasthanatraya, the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras and the Upanishads. So, the Vedantins were mostly touching this and not the Itihasa Purana portion. But he wrote an extensive commentary on the Itihasa Puranas and argued that both are telling the same thing. So, the Samanvaya at the level of texts, at the level of paths, and even at the level of, one last example I want to give for this discussion on the karma and jnana marga. We see this even in a lot of modern, the Neo Vedanta kind of communications, that karma is for immature people. Jnana is for mature and elevated souls. I mean, you see a lot of viral videos of celebrities saying so in trying to represent a tradition, which would, and so even and that has roots in some of the earlier traditions before Madhvacharya, where well, even Arjuna is considered not an elevated soul, and therefore Krishna is telling him that okay, you should engage in war. But if you're an elevated soul, that's fine, you don't need to worry about it. But to think of the implications that it can have. I mean, people can declare themselves as well, I'm elevated, I have an maturity, so I don't need to engage in the prescribed duties. And we are claiming that Bhagavad Gita is the essence of the traditional teaching. And if we dilute its teachings as those focusing on immature and not so elevated people, then the whole of Bhagavad Gita is actually significantly relegated to periphery if we go with that approach. So what Madhvacharya did was, no, karma is not only for those who haven't realized or who haven't reached the jnana stage, but even for those with jnana, karma leads to the bliss, the increase in bliss for them in moksha. In fact, he went on to define karma in the real sense as that which is done by realized people, not by those who are done by the lower rung or those who are still in the path. Of course, they also need to do karma, but even those who have reached a state of realization must also engage in karma. And that gives that role modeling to the society, that well, everybody needs to engage in karma. That ensures that there is order, there is a respect to karma. So how do you bring karma and jnana together in prescriptions is also something that he fundamentally altered. Many more such ideas where he brought these seemingly separated parts, either in terms of tenets or in terms of texts, together, and said they all can be reconciled. One last thing before I forget is the abheda bheda discussions. There are lots of textual references that talk about jiva brahma abheda. Then you have references that talk about jiva brahma bheda. Before Madhvacharya also, there were schools of dualism and there were schools of monism. So they were engaging with each other. So they were obviously posed with this problem. Mine is a monistic school, and there are verses or passages in the Vedic corpus that are talking about duality. How do I engage with them? So they created a category that, okay, this is for the early stage understanding. Once you appreciate this, then we are going to talk about the next stage where we negate what you understood earlier. Those who were talking about the duality, they had to explain monism. So they said, no, duality is the real truth. Monism or this aikya is for the purposes of contemplation. It's not true. You just think that you are so, but that doesn't mean that you become that. It is so you have to do some interpretive exercise to explain the Vedas, and people were explaining in this way. This is in fact the Nyaya school's approach. The Nyayikas were dualists, but they had to explain how do you manage the abheda vakyas. They said, okay, abheda vakyas is for upasana purposes. They are not telling you the truth. So in a way, by using some sophisticated vocabulary, people were trying to say, reject some parts without calling them untrue. So what Madhvacharya said was, well, if you deconstruct what you are trying to say, you are essentially taking one part as true and the other part as invalid. So this is as good as saying that some part of the Vedas are not telling you the truth.
Which defeats the purpose.
Which defeats the very purpose. So therefore, Madhvacharya's argument was, I'll give you an interpretation as to how, from his school's perspective, all of these can be reconciled to mean the ideas that he is trying to argue, and not use those paths where at the end would mean that you're kind of rejecting even if you're not saying in those many words. So those are some of the important ideas. There are many, but we'll.
So, as I understand it, it is pretty much about deconstructing the so-called dichotomy and then reconciling it.
Correct.
And with Samanvaya being the underlying theme of everything of his approach, basically.
Correct.
So you mentioned something about having a certain perspective, and then you justify it, and then it's sort of refuted. So this brings me to another question. There are the Charvakas. So what is the position of Charvakas in this entire arrangement? Are they seen as a separate school of thought, or what is their role?
Okay. That's a provocative question because it's a very debated topic in the contemporary discussions on do you consider Charvakas as a school or not. So you have these modern understanding of Hinduism saying that, well, you can be a Hindu, but you can be an atheist. So because Charvaka is a school that was atheistic in nature, but was still considered within the Hindu fold. Then others saying, well, that's an oxymoron. I mean, how is it possible that you don't believe in anything, but you call it a part of Hinduism? Not believing is also a part of it, etc. That is perhaps because of a misunderstanding and trying to read the translations of the traditional texts independently without an emic perspective, if I need to use that phrase. So the Charvakas in the traditional discourse are mostly used as an opponent representing a significantly important objections to the school that you are developing.
So basically like a straw man.
Yes, I mean, straw man, not in the sense of, you're not wrongly representing an idea. So, but you're not taking them as a real school of thought, but you're using that as a counterfactual, as a kind of a possible alternative that you need to be aware of and refute to get credibility to your idea. Okay. So, as a first step of establishing any school of thought, you had to engage with that idea of the Charvakas, not that Charvakas represented a legitimate theory. Because, I mean, what the in Madhvacharya's school, there is a huge discussion in many texts, and one being an important text called Vishnu Tattva Nirnaya, where he discusses the tenets of the Charvakas and refutes them. And the claim he makes is that yours is not a school of thought. So that's the point he wants to drive. That's the point he wants to prove, that yours is not a school of thought for the reason, and this is where things become interesting when we engage with traditional schools. They have very interesting frameworks for analysis. So they use this framework of Anubandha Chatushtaya to engage with the Charvakas. So for anything to be considered a school worthy of studies, they should have a Vishaya, a subject matter. There should be a Prayojana, a benefit from studying this. And there should be an Adhikari, an eligible person who needs to study. And what's the relation, the Sambandha? By studying which text, which Adhikari will get what Prayojana. So that linkage should be made clear. So his question to the Charvakas is, for yours to be considered theory worthy of even engaging, you have to define your Vishaya, Prayojana, Adhikari and Sambandha. We may not agree with many other schools like Buddhism or Nyaya, Yoga, Sankhya as they exist today, or other Uttamimamsa schools like Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, etc. But the question is not about do you have a Vishaya, Prayojana, Adhikari at all or not. The question there is, well, can you justify your Vishaya using appropriate evidence how do you, argue that that is the prayojana? Is that prayojana backed up with evidence, etc.? But here, the question is very fundamental, that do you even have?
So it's like a no starter.
Correct, no starter. It's, in fact, that's how it is called. It is anarambhaniya. It is not worthy of starting at all. So it's in fact, this framework of Vishaya, Prayojana, Sambandha and Adhikari is used for testing any text before starting, asking this exact question: is it a no starter or not? So should I study this text or not? So you have to tell at the very beginning what is the Vishaya, what is the Prayojana, or who is the Adhikari, and what's the Sambandha. So if you ask those questions to the Charvaka, so Madhvacharya's framing of that is, well, you're saying what exactly is the notion of Charvaka? It's I don't believe in anything. I mean, we need to understand that I don't believe in anything, because belief would come in areas that are not directly accessible to you. Now, I'm seeing some things here. I see a light. I see a table. I don't believe in the existence of table. I'm seeing the table. There is a difference. So I see the table, but I don't believe in anything else. So the Charvakas are non-believers. So they don't accept the existence of anything beyond what is perceptible. So beyond the pratyaksha as a tool, nothing exists outside of that realm. So Madhvacharya's question is, okay, then tell us what is the subject matter of your school. You can't say that things that are accessible to pratyaksha is the subject matter of your school, because that is anyway visible to me. I mean, I can use my sense organs and access that. Why do I need to study your school of thought to understand that? So if there isn't anything beyond the pratyaksha world in your theory, then there is actually no subject matter. So not accepting something beyond the tangible fails the test of having any Vishaya. Similarly, what is the Prayojana? By studying, so he can argue that, well, yeah, I mean, I may not have the subject matter in that sense, but I do have the subject matter that there exists nothing beyond this perceptible world. I mean, you people don't know. You are under the impression that there is something existing beyond, but my theory will help you understand that there isn't anything beyond. So there is a subject matter for my theory. So he may argue like that. So Madhvacharya's question is, okay, what is the prayojana of that? So by saying something without any basis, I mean, how do you even know that you say that there exists nothing in a realm that you can't access? And that's an oxymoron in itself, right? I mean, you have no way of accessing it. That is why it doesn't exist. Right. So even to say it doesn't exist, you should have a way to access it. So therefore, intangible, non-existing because it is intangible is not an argument that one can put forward. So even if you agree, what's the prayojana? I mean, what do I get from believing in this? Do I get something after death? Because that would be the more fundamental question for philosophers. No, there isn't, because you're saying there is nothing outside. Do I get something here? Can you guarantee that? I mean, if I go and say that there is nothing that governs as dharma and adharma, can you even guarantee safety to my very existence? I mean, it would lead to anarchy. So there isn't any prayojana. So when there is no Vishaya or no prayojana, there cannot be an eligible audience who can pursue that. So using that frame of Vishaya, prayojana and adhikari, and when there isn't an adhikari, obviously you can't have a sambandha. So in the absence of these four, it is not worthy of being considered a school of thought. So that is the way in which the Charvakas have been mostly engaged. So it is surely incorrect from the traditional perspective to count that Charvaka is also so you can be a Charvaka and be in the fold of the believers. I mean, that's just cannot.
But it's interesting, this Anubandha Chatushtaya that you mentioned, it sort of is similar to what we have today in pedagogy, rather in teaching curriculum, right? What is the what is the study? What is the subject?
Correct.
What is the module going to be about?
Correct. So the kind of learning outcomes.
Learning outcomes.
Correct.
So it's so relevant even today. So now that we mentioned the Charvakas and how they are actually non-starters, how would the veracity of, say, Madhvacharya's approach itself be upheld if he were to be criticized by, say, someone like the Charvakas? How would he have stood his ground?
So for him, the primary prayojana, as Sri Jayatirtha, one of the celebrated commentators of the Madhva tradition, puts it, that iha khalu sukhameva me syat dukkham managapi ma bhut. That's the motivation for everyone, that I should have no trace of unhappiness, and I should end in an eternal happiness. That's the pursuit, that's the purushartha. So you're trying to pursue an eternal bliss. So that is the prayojana. So the Shastra, or any school of thought in this Darshana framework, would be trying to address that purushartha. So how do you basically reach moksha? So moksha becomes your prayojana. Vishaya, this is where Madhvacharya's school would differ from most of the other schools, is that he says the greatness of Lord Vishnu is the subject matter of the entire corpus of texts. Vishnoho sarvottamatve eva sarvagamana mahatatparyam. So the primary message, the primary purport, the primary subject that is discussed is Lord Vishnu. Because, so as I said, there has to be a connect between Vishaya and Prayojana. We are interested in moksha, and it is only Lord Vishnu who can grant that moksha, and therefore necessarily you should have that as the subject matter for your pursuit. So you are trying to understand Lord Vishnu, and you develop that devotion towards him. So if the Lord is pleased by the sadhana that you are doing, you would be granted moksha. So Vishaya becomes Vishnu, or his mahima, his attributes, his noble qualities. Adhikari would be the one who is desirous of this path, the mumukshu, the one who is desiring liberation. So that mumukshu is, because he is a mumukshu, he would be engaging in a text that would tell him and take him in a path that can lead him to moksha. And Shastras being those texts that are talking about Lord Vishnu, who has the capability to give moksha, there is logic for the mumukshu to engage in these Shastras. So mumukshu engaging in the Shastras, understanding Vishnu, who has the unique or the exclusive capability to grant moksha. So that's how you see the framework of Madhvacharya. In the Anubandha Chatushtaya model, if I go back to your question on how would he respond if a Charvaka is asking this, because for Charvaka the question is not just about ontology. This is kind of an ontological frame. But how do you justify this? I mean, how do you argue that this is in fact the truth? So that's where Madhvacharya's frameworks of how to know what is pramana, all those frameworks come into picture.
So how do you explain pramana? I understand it's an idea. It's what is a pramana?
In simple terms, it's tool for knowledge. An evidence, a proof, something that can be used to gain knowledge, an instrument of knowledge. So my eyes are a pramana because my eyes can see something. So the pramana for the knowledge that I got, that okay, there exists water there. So what is the evidence? What is the proof? What is the instrument? An infallible instrument that I can rely on. that is telling me that that is a pramana. So that is one way of looking at it. But if I were to answer your question from a traditional perspective, there are two ways in which the traditional schools have engaged to a question of this sort. What is X? When you anything for that matter. So they would use, if the term is already in usage in the loka, in common parlance, then you list down all the objects for which this usage exists. So you go and ask people, if pramana is a very common term. I mean, it is a common term in the in the local Indic usage. So if you ask people, okay, what is pramana for this, and what do you understand by the term pramana? They will give you, okay, this is a pramana, this is a pramana, his word is a pramana, my eyes are a pramana. What is the pramana for you to say that there is smoke, there is fire? They would say, okay, smoke is the pramana. So what is the pramana for you to say that this person was the thief of some object? So he would say, well, I saw, and that's the pramana, right? So my eyes are the pramana, smoke is a pramana, his word is a pramana. What is the pramana to say that this train would leave the platform at so and so time? Well, what's being displayed on that board is a pramana. I mean, assuming that trains are traveling on time.
Most of these are pratyakshas, the way I understand.
Are they? So that's the. We are using pratyaksha at the first level. So pratyaksha is perception. Right. So what you see on a board for the train timings, you are seeing some light, some color, some objects, but the language, the wording that you see there is not pratyaksha. Because someone who doesn't even know how to read would still see what's being shown there. Similarly, someone who doesn't know the relationship between smoke and fire would still see smoke but won't infer fire. So while smoke is pratyaksha, the way you infer fire because of smoke is not pratyaksha. So my ability to see water can be pratyaksha. I mean, without training my eyes or without even knowing anything about how my eyes function, I would still see water. Somebody who hasn't seen this water prior can come and still see, okay, here, there is water here. But if you don't know the relationship between smoke and fire, you see smoke, but you don't infer fire. If you don't know the language, you see the board, but you don't understand what's written there. So these are three different modes of knowing. So in the first one, you used only perception. Water is there, I could see, and I don't need any other analysis there. It's a direct perception. But in the second one, I'm doing an analysis. I see smoke. I invoke my memory in terms of, is there some data in my memory that associates smoke with something, and invariably, not sometimes. And then I say, okay, there is an invariable concomitance between these two, and therefore when I see smoke, there must be fire. So that's the second type of pramana. The third type is when I see the board not just as a combination of some color and some shape, but I can see the language, I can understand the language. So I'm making sense of words. So that's a third type of pramana. So the pratyaksha, anumana, and agama. So these are the three types of pramanas that we encounter when we ask a common person, those who know the meaning of the term pramana. So to answer your question on how do you define a pramana or how do you understand a pramana, so one is this ground up approach. So you ask people, what do you understand by pramana? They will give you a list. Then you organize them, categorize them, and see if there is some common thread. And what's that common thread? It's the direct instrument of valid knowledge. That is pramana. Madhvacharya says, well, go deeper. Is that the only thing that people use as pramana? They also say that my experience is pramana. what is the pramana for you to say that you are happy? It's not your perception, it's not your inference. I mean, you know you are happy, your very knowledge is pramana. So he says it is both valid knowledge and instruments of valid knowledge. These two together constitute pramana. In the classical literature, yathartha jnana and yathartha jnana sadhana, these two together in Madhva's philosophy are pramana. So he builds the category called yathartham pramanam. So that's the definition of pramana.
So, Srinidhi ji, you mentioned the ground up approach to like explaining a pramana. What is the other one? You said there were two.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah. So, ground up is basically when the meaning of the word is known. So, pramana, the meaning is known by the community, and we are trying to understand from them and theorizing what is common in that list that they provided, and say, okay, they are using this term in this specific meaning. So, in fact, technically we use the term lakshana while trying to understand these definitions. So, what I was suggesting is a process of arriving at a lakshana by the usage that is already prevalent. So, if pramana is known to people, you go and ask them. In fact, that's a good tool for qualitative research too, because I mean sometimes one of the things that we would be interested in is in theorizing ground up. So people may not be using them in the categories that may be meaningful for a theoretical frame. They may be using it in their daily activities, but we are trying to bring that into one neat looking inductively. So there you are asking them, how do you make sense, what is the way in which you use the word pramana? So they'll give you a list, and then you find what is common in all of this and ensure that this attribute doesn't spill over to an entity that they haven't mentioned. This is the precise definition of definition itself. So this is the lakshana of a lakshana. Lakshana is a kind of an identifier, let's say. So tools of valid knowledge or valid knowledge itself. This is the definition that I gave for pramana, right? That means this description fits the entire list that people provided, and it does not spill over to any entity that's not listed here. So if any of these errors occur, we call that an alakshana.
So how, suppose I were to ask people, what do you understand by democracy?
Right.
What is a democracy?
Right.
So then I'll get a whole set of how that works.
Yeah. So okay, that's so there, because it is a term that is imposed on the population. So I mean that is not part of their cultural memory. Right? It is something that is imposed maybe over the last 2-3 generations. So you can expect it to be ingrained, but there may be confusions in that percolation. So the answers that you get from there may not be the accurate representation of what we may have had in mind when the term was communicated. So for those kinds of things, you need a deductive definition. So you start with the term, you have your definition, and you ensure that, well, there is a list of items and I have a reason to categorize them in this way. So I look for common attributes and I define those entities that have this specific property are given this name by me. That becomes a deductive definition. So you have to now use this in that way. You have to use this word in that meaning. So in a way you are building vocabulary. You are creating vocabulary. So in fact, Jaitirtha argues that the two benefits of knowing the lakshana is either to understand the vocabulary, because I mean you don't know the word democracy, for example, so you want to clarify to people, see, this is how democracy is understood. So there you are clarifying the word and meaning relationship, so you are building vocabulary. So that is one benefit of knowing Lakshana. The other benefit is to be accurately identifying the object. So when people are using the word pramana, I need to be aware of what exactly they have in their minds. So so when you ground up, come up with a definition, you can point out when that same word is used elsewhere, that okay, this is the meaning in which they used it. So Lakshana can be arrived at if the word is known, that is the meaning of the word is known, but they are not articulating that exclusive attribute, then you arrive at that exclusive attribute, that makes it a Lakshana. Or you start with the exclusive attribute and give that word, and that gets into the usage. That is also a way of popularizing that Lakshana. So Lakshana can be both inductive or deductive.
So in this arrangement that you explained, what was the uniqueness of Madhvacharya's approach?
Okay. So some of the frameworks that I used are not unique. So the Anubandha Chatushtaya framework that I explained, or the way to identify the meaning of Lakshana itself, these are not unique to Madhvacharya school. But what is pramana? For example, the Nyaya school was talking about only the instruments of knowledge as pramana. The Mimamsaka school was talking about knowledge per se as pramana, and Madhvacharya suggested, well, both of them are pramanas. And some were suggesting there isn't an idea called erroneous knowledge. So he said, no, there is an idea called erroneous knowledge, and therefore we need to be careful in defining and use the adjective valid knowledge to address that concern. So the definition of pramana was unique. Moreover, in the classification, because the framework that we usually use is after you define, after you give the Lakshana, you do the classification, you do the Vibhaga, and then you do the Pariksha. So this is a classical framework, again, not unique to Madhvacharya school. No, you start with the Uddesha, you start with the name, that is pramana, you define it, you classify it, then you examine whether your definition and your classification are making sense when compared with others. So in that, his classification included knowledge and tools, Kevala Pramana and Anupramana. The tools are of three types. The one that I explained tangentially, I think, earlier, pratyaksha, anumana, and agama. So basically the direct perception, logical inference, and then valid words. So these are the three tools. And he argues that, some say 4, some say 6, some say 8. He says, well, it is possible to count anything beyond 3 into these 3 itself. So arthapatti, abhava, upamana. So these are some of the pramanas. Shabda is nothing but agama. So these are counted by some other schools as different pramanas. He says, well, they are pramanas, but they all fall under these 3 only. So arthapatti is only a special type of anumana. Abhava is sometimes special type of pratyaksha, sometimes anumana, sometimes even agama. So it is possible. So there is a detailed discussion in Madhvacharya's epistemological works on how you can recategorize the 6 or any number of pramanas into these 3.
Basically, he was making it parsimonious.
Parsimonious, yeah. And that was something very striking in a lot of his works. He does a parsimonious classification for the an idea called nigrahasthanas, an idea that is used in debates to so what is the point of defeat when you are so the Nayayikas had some 22 plus nigrahasthanas. When do you say that the person is has lost the debate? So Madhvacharya brought it down to 6. He says, well, I can explain all these 6, all these 22 in this 6. And that helps in conceptualizing the idea. And also there is a logic that he explains as to why it makes sense to be parsimonious in this way. But the critical importance or the uniqueness in Madhvacharya's pramana categorization, I would say, is something that would link it back to your perhaps an earlier inquiry on how would he respond to the Charvakas. Because, see, you said pratyaksha, anumana and agama, fine, but I don't agree that there is something called anumana or agama. I only believe in pratyaksha. So how do you answer that? Or I believe only in pratyaksha or anumana. I don't believe in agama. So how do you answer that? So he gets into the details of justifying why one has to accept. There are three different tools of acquiring knowledge. But more interesting than that is how do you rank order them? So if there is a conflict between pratyaksha and agama, what do you do? I think that is where his idea has been very bold. He said, well, pratyaksha, especially the inner pratyaksha, what we call experience or anubhava, that is paramount. Even if an apparent meaning of a Vedic passage is contradicting what you have experienced, then go with the experience. Does it then mean that you are rejecting the meaning of a Vedic sentence? He says, no, that's not the meaning of the sentence. You have to dig deeper to understand what that actually meant. Because if you falsify your very experience, then there is absolutely no way to access knowledge. Because experience is at the heart of acquiring knowledge, and experience has to be categorized as something that is infallible. And that's our experience. I mean, something that we have experienced has never gone wrong, has never been proved wrong later. I'm happy, I'm thirsty, I'm hungry. These are the, I mean, not the experience of, I should clarify this because sometimes experience is used in the sense of anecdotal evidence. Whether this treatment works or not. Well, my experience tells me that this is not a good treatment, but there is a protocol telling that okay, this is actually the good treatment. So can my experience contradict that evidence? That's not the meaning of experience. The experience is this did not work in a specific case that I administered. That is the experience. But to say that this protocol doesn't work in my future applications is outside the scope of your experience. But we use that word, no, I have experienced it, I don't want to get. So that's a very, that may be the meaning in English communication, but that's not the meaning of the word experience here. We are talking about experience in the sense of anubhava, my inner knowledge. My knowledge it does not have the scope to talk about the future instance. If it is an exact similar instance, it may say so. Drinking water addresses my thirst. This is my experience today. But I'm sure that it is going to be this case even tomorrow. I'm also sure that this is the case even for you, for someone else. So the experience that Madhvacharya is talking about is an universal experience. It is something that we all experience, but I may not have access to your experience, but I know that you are surely having the same experience. And he says, take that as the ground rule, ground epistemic foundation, based on which you build other tools of evidence. So if the Vedic corpus or your argument is going against this experience, then this takes precedence and you reinterpret or find a way to understand them. So that I think is the crux in Madhvacharya's school of bringing the whole epistemological discussion back to the meaning of anubhava and basing it from that base, develop pratyaksha, anumana and agama as the three tools. In fact, the necessity to accept these three tools as valid knowledge tools is also from our experience. So he has this idea of developing many of his tenets from the first principles of experience. And therefore, I sometimes think that without connoting it in simplistic sense, we can perhaps talk about this as the commonsensical Vedantic approach that Madhvacharya was trying to build.
So that was That was a whole lot of things out there. So just to summarize from our discussions today, what I'm seeing, what I have understood, and what we discussed is once we get information basically from sensory perceptions, the pratyaksha. So what we need to do next is that this information, we have to fix that the information that we have thus obtained is valid and correct. And that means fixing the tools of study, or the epistemology needs to be fixed correctly. Essentially, to study how to study, say, the world or the phenomena, that part needs to be fixed. And that, along with the other tools of anumana and the subset of tools to analyze, to make sense, to deduce, to infer. So these tools of epistemology needs to be fixed so that the ontology, which ontology would be where we apply these tools of epistemology and build it over epistemology essentially. So that stands firm. So once the epistemology tools are firm, then I guess it's smooth sailing. What I've also understood is that the various schools of the Vedanta schools essentially engaged with each other over long periods of time by way of refining, defining, clarifying their tools of inquiry even better. So they were making it more robust, and so that the ontology that's built on it stands stable as well. In this, Madhvacharya's approach, like you mentioned just now, was that nothing can falsify experience, that's Anubhava, and that experience is sacrosanct and true. And any explanation that goes around explaining the experience is the one that needs to be made rigorous so that it stands in sync with the experience. You can't change the experience in order for it to fit the explanation. It's the explanation that needs to fit with the experience, right? That's one thing. And the other thing that you mentioned was that there are ways of knowing, and the objects of knowing are different in different realms and different scales. So there are things that one can experience, which one can understand from experience. Ones that need to be logically inferred, that's the second. And third is those that have to be taught, right? So basically what Sri Madhvacharya was saying is that in this tools of epistemology, pratyaksha, anumana, agama, all three have very important roles to play, right? So that's one of the things. Then in terms of ontology, again, from what I've understood is in the Madhva approach, it is the pursuit of eternal happiness or moksha, but it's within the challenges of navigating through and engaging with the material world and everyday life. So Madhva's ontology did not separate the spiritual and the material, did not treat them as disconnected parts, because that can confuse the seeker. Essentially, Madhvacharya's ontology bridged the spiritual and the material. So everything that would make everything in this material world revolve around the Supreme. That's Lord Vishnu and his blessings. So I think we'll probably deep dive further into this in our next episode on Sri Madhvacharya's Tattvavada's philosophical tenets. Thank you so much, Srinidhi ji, for this extremely interesting, insightful and refreshing discussion, and hope to carry this forward in our next episode.
Thank you, Sarita ji. I mean, this is hopefully an initial discussion on the basic frameworks of the epistemology, and the philosophical tenets we'll get into, as you said, next. Yeah, thank you.
Dhanyavad.